The Evolution of Modesty, Part 2, Section 2 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume-1 by Havelock Ellis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Thomas Coos. The Evolution of Modesty, Part 2, Section 2. Long ago, when a hospital student on midwifery duty in London slums, I had occasion to observe that among the women of the poor, and more especially in those who had lost the first bloom of youth, modesty consisted chiefly in the fear of being disgusting. There was an almost pathetic anxiety in the face of pain and discomfort not to be disgusting in the doctor's eyes. This anxiety expressed itself in the ordinary symptoms of modesty, but as soon as the woman realized that I found nothing disgusting in whatever was proper and necessary to be done under the circumstances, it almost invariably happened that every sign of modesty at once disappeared. In the special and elementary conditions of parturition, modesty is reduced to this one fear of causing disgust, so that when that is negated, the emotion is non-existent, and the subject becomes, without effort, as direct and natural as a little child. A fellow student on similar duty, who also discovered for himself the same character of modesty, that if he was careful to guard her modesty, the woman was careful also, and that if he was not, the woman was not, remarked on it to me with sadness. It seemed to him derogatory to womanhood that what he had been accustomed to consider its supreme grace should be so superficial that he could at will set limits to it. I thought then, as I think still, that that was rather a perversion of the matter, and that nothing becomes degrading because we happen to have learned something about its operations. But I am more convinced than ever that the fear of causing disgust, a fear quite distinct from that of losing a sexual lure or breaking a rule of social etiquette, plays a very large part in the modesty of the more modest sex, and in modesty generally. Our Venuses, as Lucretius long since remarked, and Montaigne after him, are careful to conceal from their lovers the vita poscenia, and that fantastic fate which placed so near together the supreme foci of physical attraction and physical repugnance, has immensely contributed to build up all the subtlest coquetries of courtship. Whatever stimulates self-confidence and lulls the fear of evoking disgust, whether it is the presence of a beloved person, in whose good opinion complete confidence is felt, or whether it is merely the grosser narcotizing influence of a slight degree of intoxication, always automatically lulls the emotion of modesty. Together with the animal factor of sexual refusal, this social fear of evoking disgust seems to me the most fundamental element in modesty. It is, of course, impossible to argue that the fact of the sacro-pubic region of the body being the chief focus of concealment proves the importance of this factor of modesty, but it may fairly be argued that it owes this position not merely to being the sexual center, but also as being the excretory center. Even among many lower mammals, as well as among birds and insects, there is a well-marked horror of dirt, somewhat disguised by the varying ways in which an animal may be said to define dirt. Many animals spend more time and energy in the duties of cleanliness than human beings, and they often show well-marked anxiety to remove their own excrement or to keep away from it. Thus, the element of modesty also may be said to have an animal basis. It is on this animal basis that the human and social fear of arousing disgust has developed. Its probably wide extension is indicated not only by the strong feeling attached to the constant presence of clothing on this part of the body, such as constant presence being quite uncalled for if the garment or ornament is merely a sort of sexual war paint, but by the repugnance felt by many savages very low down in the scale to the public satisfaction of natural needs and to their more than civilized cleanliness in this connection. It is further of interest to note that in some parts of the world the covering is not in front but behind, though of this fact there are probably other explanations. Among civilized people, also, it may be added, the final and invincible seat of modesty is sometimes not around the pubes but the anus. That is to say that in such cases the fear of arousing disgust is the ultimate and most fundamental element of modesty. The concentration of modesty around the anus is sometimes very marked. Many women feel so high a degree of shame and reserve with regard to this region that they are comparatively indifferent to an anterior examination of the sexual organs. A similar feeling is not seldom found in men. I would permit of an examination of my genitals by a medical man without any feeling of discomfort. A correspondent writes, "But I think I would rather die than submit to any rectal examination." Even physicians have been known to endure painful rectal disorders for years rather than undergo examination. Among ordinary English girls, a medical correspondent writes, "I have often noticed that the dislike and shame of allowing a man to have sexual intercourse with them when newly married is simply due to the fact that the sexual aperture is so closely opposed to the anus and bladder. If the vulva and vagina were situated between a woman's shoulder blades, and a man had a separate instrument for coitus, not used for any excretory purpose, I do not think women would feel about intercourse as they sometimes do." Again, in their ignorance of anatomy, women often look upon the vagina and womb as part of the bowel and its exit of discharge, and sometimes say, for instance, inflammation of the bowel, when they mean womb. Again, many, perhaps most, women believe that they pass water through the vagina and are ignorant of the existence of the separate urethral orifice. Again, women associate the vulva with the anus and so feel ashamed of it, even when speaking to their husbands or to a doctor or among themselves, they have absolutely no name for the vulva. I mean among the upper classes and people of gentle birth, but speak of it as down below, low down, etc. Even though this feeling is largely based on wrong and ignorant ideas, it must still be recognized that it is to some extent natural and inevitable. "How much is risked," exclaimed Dugas in Privacies of Love. "The results may be disillusion, disgust, the consciousness of physical imperfection, of brutality or coldness, of aesthetic disenchantment, of a sentimental shock, seen or divined. To be without modesty, that is to say, to have no fear of the ordeals of love, one must be sure of oneself, of one's grace, of one's physical emotions, of one's feelings, and be sure, moreover, of the effect of all these on the nerves, the imagination, and the heart of another person. Let us suppose modesty reduced to aesthetic discomfort, to a woman's fear of displeasing, or of not seeming beautiful enough. Even thus defined, how can modesty avoid being always awake and restless? What woman could repeat, without risk, the tranquil action of Phryne? And even in that action, who knows how much may not have been due to mere professional insolence? Dugas, La Pugere, Revue Philosophique, November 1903. Men and Women, Schwartz points out, Altersklassen and Mannerbund, page 41 to 51, have certainly the capacity mutually to supplement and enrich each other, but when this completion fails, or is not sought, the difference may easily become a strong antipathy, and he proceeds to develop the wide-reaching significance of this psychic fact. I have emphasized the proximity of the excretory centers to the sexual focus in discussing this important factor of modesty, because in analyzing so complex and elusive an emotion as modesty, it is desirable to keep as near as possible to the essential and fundamental facts on which it is based. It is scarcely necessary to point out that in ordinary civilized society these fundamental facts are not usually present at the surface of consciousness and may even be absent altogether. On the foundation of them may rise all sorts of idealized fears or delicate reserves of aesthetic refinements as the emotions of love become more complex and more subtle, and the crude simplicity of the basis on which they finally rest becomes inevitably concealed. Another factor of modesty which reaches a high development in savagery is the ritual element, especially the idea of ceremonial uncleanness, based on a dread of the supernatural influences which the sexual organs and functions are supposed to exert. It may be to some extent rooted in the elements already referred to, and it leads us into a much wider field than that of modesty, so that it is only necessary to touch slightly on it here. It has been exhaustively studied by Fraser and by Crawley. Offenses against the ritual, rendered necessary by this mysterious dread, though more serious than offenses against sexual reticence or the fear of causing disgust, are so obviously allied that they all reinforce one another and cannot easily be disentangled. Nearly everywhere, all over the world, at a primitive stage of thought, and even to some extent in the highest civilization, the sight of the sexual organs, or of the sexual act, the image, or even the names of the sexual parts of either man or woman, are believed to have a curiously potent influence, sometimes beneficent, but quite as often maleficent. The two kinds of influence may even be combined, and Riedel, quoted by Ploss and Bartels, states that the Ambon Islanders carve a schematic representation of the vulva on their fruit trees, in part to promote the productiveness of the trees, and in part to scare any unauthorized person who might be tempted to steal the fruit. The precautions prescribed as regards coitus at Loango are evidently associated with religious fears. In Ceylon, again, as a medical correspondent there informs me, where the penis is worshipped and held sacred, a native never allows it to be seen except under compulsion by a doctor, and even a wife must neither see it nor touch it, nor ask for coitus, though she must grant as much as the husband desires. All savage and barbarous peoples who have attained any high degree of ceremonialism have included the functions not only of sex but also of excretion, more or less stringently within the bounds of that ceremonialism. It is only necessary to refer to the Jewish ritual books of the Old Testament, to Hesiod, and to the customs prevalent among Mohammedan peoples. Modesty in eating also has its roots by no means only in the fear of causing disgust, but very largely in this kind of ritual, and Crawley has shown how numerous and frequent among primitive peoples are the religious implications of eating and drinking. So profound is this dread of the sacred mystery of sex, and so widespread is the ritual based upon it, that some have imagined that here alone we may find the complete explanation of modesty, and Salomon Reinach declares that at the origin of the emotion of modesty lies a taboo. Durkheim, La prohibition de l'inceste, l'année sociologique, 1898, page 50, arguing that whatever sense of repugnance women may inspire must necessarily reach the highest point around the womb, which is hence subjected to the most stringent taboo. Incidentally, suggests that here is an origin of modesty. The sexual organs must be veiled at an early period, to prevent the dangerous effluvia which they give off from reaching the environment. The veil is often a method of intercepting magic action. Once constituted, the practice would be maintained and transformed. It was doubtless as a secondary and derived significance that the veil became, as Reinach, Le Voile de l'Oblation, cite page 299 to 311, shows it was, alike among the Romans and in the Catholic Church, the sign of consecration of the gods. At an early stage of culture, again, menstruation is regarded as a process of purification, a dangerous expulsion of vitiated humors. Hence the term catharsis applied to it by the Greeks. Hence, also, the medieval view of women, mulier speciosa templum edificatum super cloacam, said Boethius. The sacropubic region in women, because it excludes the source of menstruation, thus becomes a specially heightened seat of taboo, according to the Mosaic law, Leviticus chapter 20, volume 18. If a man uncovered a menstruating woman, both were to be cut off. It is probable that the Mohammedan custom of veiling the face and head really has its source solely in another aspect of this ritual factor of modesty. It must be remembered that this custom is not Mohammedan in its origin, since it existed long previously among the Arabians, and is described by Tertullian. In early Arabia, very handsome men also veiled their faces in order to preserve themselves from the evil eye. And it has been conjectured, with much probability, that the origin of the custom of women veiling their faces may be traced to this magico-religious precaution. Among the Jews of the same period, according to Büchler, the women had their heads covered and never cut their hair. To appear in the streets without such covering would be like a prostitute and was adequate ground for divorce. Adulterous women were punished by uncovering their heads and cutting their hair. It is possible, though not certain, that St. Paul's obscure injunction to women to cover their heads because of the angels may really be based on the ancient reason that, when uncovered, they would be exposed to the wanton assaults of spirits. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, v. 5-6. Exactly as Singhalese women believe that they must keep the vulva covered lest demons should have intercourse with them. Even at the present day, St. Paul's injunction is still observed by Christendom, which is, however, far from accepting, or even perhaps understanding, the folklore ground on which are based such injunctions. Crawley thus summarizes some of the evidence concerning the significance of the veil. Sexual shyness, not only in woman but in man, is intensified at marriage, and forms a chief feature of the dangerous sexual properties mutually feared. When fully ceremonial, the idea takes on the meaning that satisfaction of these feelings will lead to their neutralization, as in fact it does. The bridegroom in ancient Sparta supped on the wedding night at the men's mess, and then visited his bride, leaving her before daybreak. This practice was continued, and sometimes children were born before the pair had ever seen each other's faces by day. At weddings in the Babar Islands, the bridegroom has to hunt for his bride in a darkened room. This lasts a good while if she is shy. In South Africa, the bridegroom may not see his bride till the whole of the marriage ceremonies have been performed. In Persia, a husband never sees his wife till he has consummated the marriage. At marriages in South Arabia, the bride and bridegroom have to sit immovable in the same position from noon till midnight, fasting in separate rooms. The bride is attended by ladies, and the groom by men. They may not see each other till the night of the fourth day. In Egypt, the groom cannot see the face of his bride, even by a surreptitious glance, till she is in his absolute possession. Then comes the ceremony, which he performs, of uncovering her face. In Egypt, of course, this has been accentuated by the seclusion and veiling of women. In Morocco, at the feast before the marriage, the bride and groom sit together on a sort of throne. All the time the poor bride's eyes are firmly closed, and she sits amidst the revelry as immovable as a statue. On the next day is the marriage. She is conducted after dark to her future home, accompanied by a crowd with lanterns and candles. She is led with closed eyes along the street by two relatives, each holding one of her hands. The bride's head is held in its proper position by a female relative who walks behind her. She wears a veil and is not allowed to open her eyes until she is set on the bridal bed, with a girl friend beside her. Amongst the Zulus, the bridal party proceeds to to the house of the groom, having the bride hidden amongst them. They stand facing the groom while the bride sings a song. Her companions then suddenly break away, and she is discovered standing in the middle, with a fringe of beads covering her face. Amongst the people of Kumaun, the husband sees his wife first after the joining of hands. Amongst the Bedouin of northeast Africa, the bride is brought on the evening of the wedding day by her girl friends to the groom's house. She is closely muffled up. Amongst the Jews of Jerusalem, the bride, at the marriage ceremony, stands under the nuptial canopy, her eyes being closed, that she may not behold the face of her future husband before she reaches the bridal chamber. In Melanesia, the bride is carried to her new home on someone's back, wrapped in many mats, with palm fans held about her face. Because she is supposed to be modest and shy, among the Damaras, the groom cannot see his bride for 4 days after marriage. When a Damara woman is asked in marriage, she covers her face for a time with the flap of a headdress made for this purpose. At the Thlinkit marriage ceremony, the bride must look down and keep her head bowed all the time. During the wedding day, she remains hiding in a corner of the house, and the groom is forbidden to enter. At a Yazidi marriage, the bride is covered from head to foot with a thick veil, and when arrived at her new home, she retires behind a curtain in the corner of a darkened room, where she remains for 3 days before her husband is permitted to see her. In Korea, the bride has to cover her face with her long sleeves when meeting the bridegroom at the wedding. The Manchurian bride uncovers her face for the first time when she descends from the nuptial couch. It is dangerous even to see dangerous persons. Sight is a method of contagion in primitive science, and the idea coincides with the psychological aversion to see dangerous things, and with sexual shyness and timidity. In the customs noticed, we can distinguish the feeling that it is dangerous to the bride for her husband's eyes to be upon her, and the feeling of bashfulness in her which induces her neither to see him nor to be seen by him. These ideas explain the origin of the bridal veil and similar concealments. The bridal veil is used, to take a few instances, in China, Burma, Korea, Russia, Bulgaria, Manchuria, and Persia, and in all these cases it conceals the face entirely. E. Crawley, The Mystic Rose, page 328, at sequence. Alexander Walker, writing in 1846, remarks, among old-fashioned people, of whom a good example may be found in old country people of the middle class in England, it is indecent to be seen with the head unclothed. Such a woman is terrified at the chance of being seen in that condition, and if intruded on at that time, she shrieks with terror and flies to conceal herself. A. Walker Beauty, page 15. This fear of being seen with the head uncovered exists still. M. Van Gennep informs me in some regions of France, as in Bretagne. So far it has only been necessary to refer incidentally to the connection of modesty with clothing. I have sought to emphasize the unquestionable but often forgotten fact that modesty is in its origin independent of clothing, that physiological modesty takes precedence of anatomical modesty, and that the primary factors of modesty were certainly developed long before the discovery of either ornament or garments. The rise of clothing probably had its first psychical basis on an emotion of modesty already compositely formed of the elements we have traced. Both the main elementary factors, it may be noted, must naturally tend to develop and unite in a more complex, though it may well be much less intense emotion. The impulse which leads the female animal, as it leads some African women, when found without their girdles, to squat firmly down on the earth, becomes a more refined and extended play of gesture and ornament and garment, A very notable advance, I may remark, is made when this primary attitude of defense against the action of the male becomes a defense against his eyes. We may thus explain the spread of modesty to various parts of the body, even when we exclude the more special influence of the evil eye. The breasts very early become a focus of modesty in women. This may be observed among many naked or nearly naked Negro races. The tendency of the nates to become the chief seat of modesty in many parts of Africa may probably be, in large part, thus explained, since the full development of the gluteal regions is often the greatest attraction an African woman can possess. The same cause contributes, doubtless, to the face becoming, in some races, the center of modesty. We see the influence of this defense against strange eyes in the special precautions in gesture or clothing taken by the women in various parts of the world against the more offensive eyes of civilized Europeans. But, in thus becoming directed only against sight and not against action, the gestures of modesty are at once free to become merely those of coquetry. When there is no real danger of offensive action, there is no need for more than playful defense, and no serious anxiety should that defense be taken as a disguised invitation. Thus the road is at once fully open toward the most civilized manifestations of the comedy of courtship. End of the Evolution of Modesty, Part 2, Section 2, read by John Thomas Coos. www.validatelife.com